Government Regulation of Competition and Prices, Chapter 5. In this chapter, we're going to look at one of the specific powers of the federal government, its power to regulate commerce through some specific statutes. We're going to look at the power the government has to ensure free markets, to regulate markets and competitors, and to regulate the supply chain. The federal government has the authority to regulate business that affects or advances the nation's economic needs. Where does this power come from? The Commerce Clause. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3 sets forth that the federal government may regulate commerce among the several states. We refer to this as interstate commerce. Now, as part of regulating interstate commerce, the federal government has come up with laws that govern the conduct of businesses in an effort to prohibit unfair methods of competition. So let's look at those specifically. The antitrust laws. From your reading and the materials that I have provided, you have seen that sometimes individual businesses can become so large or so powerful, or can work together in ways that manipulate the market system, that they take advantage and make it more difficult for competitors. And because we are a capitalist society, we want free markets. We want buyers to get the benefit of businesses freely competing and driving down price, not to have our markets manipulated by any one individual business or person. So we have what's called antitrust laws that came out of a time period. They came out of a time period where large businesses were actually manipulating the market, and antitrust laws were designed to correct that problem. And we're going to look at a few in particular: the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Act, the Robinson-Patman Act, and to a lesser extent, we're going to look at the Federal Trade Commission Act. The Sherman Act of 1890 was designed to regulate the horizontal markets or a business's competitors. So let's look at, what does that mean, the horizontal market? What is a horizontal market? The horizontal market consists of a business's direct competitors. So for instance, if you are a vendor selling t-shirts at GEHO, your horizontal market consists of all of the other t-shirt vendors who show up at the event and who are going to be selling a similar product in direct competition to you. So the Sherman Act of 1890 regulates horizontal markets or competitors. Those are synonyms. So it creates laws that govern how direct competitors may interact with one another. What does the Sherman Act provide? And it's very important that you pay attention to the numbers and which section we're talking about. The first section of the Sherman Antitrust Act that we're going to be talking about is Section 1. So Sherman Section 1 provides that every contract, combination, or conspiracy in the restraint of trade is illegal. Those are the important concepts in this law. Every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade is illegal. What is the result if you engage in a contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade? You, if found guilty, will be guilty of a felony, punishable by a fine up to $10 million if you're a corporation, or $350,000 if you're a person, and you may even go to jail. So this would be an example of a federal law that would also be criminal in nature, because not only might you have to pay fines, but you could also lose your liberty. Let's look more closely at the elements of a Section 1 Sherman Act violation. First, you have to have a combination, contract, or conspiracy. What does that mean? In order to be charged with a violation of Section 1 Sherman Act, you have to have at least two individuals or two businesses working together. Because in order to have a combination, you've got to have more than one business. So you could have businesses who are working together, combination, or who actually enter into a formal agreement, as in a contract, or who are just conspiring together. And what are these businesses conspiring together to do? To commit an unreasonable restraint of trade. What does that mean? We're going to talk about that in a second. And whatever restraint they come up with must affect interstate commerce. Why does it have to affect interstate commerce? Because this is a federal statute. And we've learned the federal government only has the power to regulate interstate commerce. If the unreasonable restraint of trade only affects trade within a state, then that would be a matter for state law. So let's think of an example. Let's go back to our vendors at GEHO. Every year at GEHO, we have lots of vendors come in with lots of great t-shirts and blankets and other wear, all branded with A&T logos and things. And sometimes they have other colleges and stuff that you might be interested in, right? Let's assume that we have 5 vendors who get together and agree, no matter what time of day it is, whether or not it's hours before the game or 5 minutes before it's supposed to end, we will not drop our t-shirt prices below $20. No matter what time, we don't care if they're packing up and everybody's leaving, we're not going to drop our t-shirt prices. Now, why might they do that? They might do that because a lot of times people wait. If you like to shop around, you identify the t-shirt you want, possibly when you're going into the game, but you want to wait and see if you can get it lower once the game is finally over and people are leaving and vendors realize that they haven't sold all of their goods and maybe they don't feel like packing them up to take them home. So you're hoping maybe they'll drop the price of the t-shirts. They might go down to half off, $10. I've even been at GEHO when you'd have a desperate vendor who said all t-shirts are $5, right? Now, what does that tell us? One, it tells us those t-shirts probably didn't cost that much to produce in the first place, which is why they dropped them so low. And 2, it lets you know that with the time demands of the pressure, that a seller might be willing to drop their price to be more competitive because they'd like to make the sale. And so from the seller's perspective, they make less money when they do that. Even though they might still be making a good margin, they're making less than what they had intended. So the sellers might get crafty, become shrewd and say, if we would just tacitly agree that none of us will drop our prices, the buyers wouldn't have any choice. If they want an Aggie t-shirt, they will pay $20. Now, the vendors who choose to do this could do it informally, where they just have a little conversation about it, or they could put it in a contract. How formal does that contract have to be? But they have to write it? No, they could actually text each other. Vendor 1 could text in a group me, could text the other vendors and say, hey, nobody drop your shirt prices below $20. And everybody else write back deal. That's an offer and an acceptance. And as you're going to learn later in the class, that's a contract. And so it doesn't have to actually be in a writing. Or at least, let's say they did that, that's enough evidence of at least a combination or conspiracy, even if that wasn't enough for a contract. So then we'd have our first element of a Sherman Section 1 Act, because those 5 vendors would have agreed together to not drop their prices below $20. Now, their agreement to not drop below $20 would be their restraint on trade. Why? Because when they agree to fix their prices at a certain amount, they are affecting, restraining, manipulating the market. Now the t-shirt prices aren't dependent upon demand, they're dependent upon the agreement that the sellers already came to. So that's the restraint of trade piece. Then the question would be, well, does that affect interstate commerce? So in our first scenario with our 5 vendors, $20 at GEHO, if this agreement is just during GEHO, you can probably make the argument that does not affect interstate trade, because these are sales that are only taking place within North Carolina, and actually more specifically just within the city of Greensboro. So although this might be manipulative behavior, it doesn't rise to the level of a Section 1 Sherman Act violation. Now, if you're mad about that and say, hey, they're still tampering with the market, there is probably a North Carolina antitrust statute that is similar to the federal law. And so if you knew about it, you could use a state law. So even though we're just looking at federal laws, I want you to realize that's one of the beauties of our parallel systems. Even if we can't get them on this is federal law, there's probably a corresponding state law. But let's look at some specifics and flesh this out a little more, because there's a few important words here. We need to look at what's an unreasonable restraint of trade and whether or not this is affecting interstate commerce. Let's look at. We've got a test. We've got a test that we can use to determine whether there is an unreasonable restraint of trade. So when our 5 Aggie vendors agree to not drop their prices below $20 for shirts they're selling during GEHO, at first blush, we could say, well, clearly this is not a Section 1 Sherman violation because it's only intrastate. So we wouldn't even have to go through this reasonableness test. But what if those vendors agreed not to drop below $20 at any HBCU homecoming that they sell products at on the East Coast? Because many of the t-shirt vendors that we encounter at events are in the business of going to homecomings and conferences and sorority and fraternity events all over the country. So if you're in one of these activities, or if you go to a lot of homecomings and conferences around the country, you will begin to see the same vendors. And I have seen this. You'll see a vendor at your sorority fraternity conference. You'll see them at your HBCU homecoming. You'll see them during some kind of marquee game. Same vendors. So what if those 5 vendors agreed not to drop their prices below $20 at everywhere they sell? Then you've got that third element of affecting interstate commerce. So on its face, it looks like that could be a potential violation. So that's when we want to look more closely at whether or not their restraint on trade is reasonable or not, because the 3 elements require a contract combination or conspiracy that is an unreasonable restraint of trade that affects interstate commerce. So that raises the question of what is an unreasonable restraint of trade. Apparently, you can have some restraints that are reasonable and therefore are not illegal. So the test that we use is called the rule of reason. You do an analysis and you look at, do the benefits of their behavior outweigh the harm? So in our example, the benefits of the sellers fixing their prices at $20, therefore keeping their level of profit at their target, does that outweigh the harm it does to the market for the buyers who are looking to purchase? So how do we figure that out? We've got 4 elements that we would weigh. First, we look at what's the nature and purpose of the restraint. The restraint, remember, is referring to what the parties have agreed to do. So in our scenario, what is the purpose of the vendors agreeing to keep their price at $20? Well, the purpose is so that they keep their profits high. What is the scope of the restraint? This element refers to how much of the market are they affecting? What's the reach? What's the span? So scope is like how much of the market is affected. So to answer that question, we need to know how many vendors there are. So at GEHO, if you had 100 vendors and only 5 of them agreed to fix their prices at $20, even though the purpose of their restraint is to keep prices artificially high to maintain their profit. And let's say that the effect of the restraint, which is our next element, is to make it harder for buyers to get better prices. And clearly they're doing it so that they can maintain their profit share. And let's say that these 5 vendors are of the type that are going all over the nation. They're not just coming to our campus. They've agreed to price fix at $20 everywhere they go. If they're such a small part of the market that really their agreement doesn't make it difficult for us as buyers to find other sellers at different price points, then this would not be a violation. Did you catch that? So if you go through the analysis, right, we've got our 5 vendors who are acting in contract, combination, or conspiracy. What's their restraint of trade? They have agreed to keep their t-shirt prices at $20 no matter what. And we are assuming they're going to do this at every place that they sell, right? So it is interstate. And we're looking at our rule of reason analysis, trying to decide, is this $20 price fix reasonable or not? The nature and purpose of their restraint clearly is to keep their profits high. But the problem we're going to have with these 5 vendors is, in this weighing process, is their impact on the market. The scope of their restraint seems like it might be small if it's only 5 vendors and the whole universe of vendors at GEHO is more like 100. So how you're going to come out in this reasonable test actually depends upon the facts. If it's 5 vendors out of 8, well, then this restraint has a huge impact on the market. Buyers are not going to have many options. If it's 5 vendors out of 10, we've got a tougher weighing situation, don't we? It's kind of hard to tell. Would the benefit of their behavior outweigh the harm? We still have 50% of the market available to us to purchase from as buyers, right? So if you think about it as a, percent-wise, when the restraint is taking up a large portion of the market such that buyers don't have much choice, the law is going to tend to find that that restraint of trade meets the unreasonableness test and is therefore illegal. If the combination, contract, or conspiracy is so small, they can agree to do whatever they want to, but the rest of us can go and find all these different other vendors to purchase from, then probably their conduct will not be considered illegal. It wouldn't satisfy all 3 elements of a Sherman Section 1 violation. Now, the 4th element of the intent of the restraint is very similar and very analogous to element 1 about the nature and purpose. The intent of the price agreement of selling the shirts at $20 is clearly so that the sellers can maintain a certain amount of profit. So elements 1 and 4 are about the same here. Scope is how much impact they're making. And then the 3rd element, which I've already talked about a little bit, the effect. What effect do they actually have on the market? Are the 5 vendors actually able to constrain the market? Do they make it more difficult for the buyers to find affordable shirts, given our example? You might have a situation where you have a small number of vendors who get together and create a restraint. So it's 5 out of 50. But maybe those 5 have the largest selection of goods. They have the best selection of goods. Their quality is superior such that the remaining 45 vendors are there, but the effect on competition is such that buyers really still don't have much of a choice, because the other 45, what they are offering is so substandard or so different in kind that really the 5 vendors who entered into this deal, they have shut everybody out. If that is the case, then maybe you could still say it's an unreasonable restraint of trade using this element of the effect. What do I want you to understand here is that whether or not conduct violates Section 1 of the Sherman Act requires on its face those 3 elements. You got to have a contract, combination, or conspiracy that is an unreasonable restraint of trade, and it must affect interstate commerce. But whether or not the restraint is unreasonable requires an analysis of these 4 factors. And how you look at these 4 factors depends upon the facts of the circumstances. What the bad actors actually did. All right? Then we have something that's called a per se violation. This is another Latin term. A per se violation indicates that a plaintiff bringing a claim must merely show that there was prohibited conduct that took place, and that it is assumed that is an unreasonable restraint of trade. Plaintiff bringing a claim must merely show prohibited conduct that is assumed to be an unreasonable restraint of trade. What does that mean? So it sounds so awkward, but there's some conduct, there are some violations that if a plaintiff says this is what the vendors did, on its face the court will assume that what they did was unreasonable. That's what a per se violation is. A per se violation is under the law. If the plaintiff can claim that the defendants did these 3 things, we will assume that there was an unreasonable restraint of trade, and we won't go through this rule of reason analysis. And there's a few examples of it. So these are the top 3 per se violations of Section 1. In other words, as long as the plaintiff says, and remember, the plaintiff can state in their complaint, and they lay out in their paragraphs the facts. If they state that there was an agreement among competitors to fix their prices, that constitutes a per se violation of the Sherman Act, right? Which is actually what I just described. If you all are a GEHO and you got wind, you knew that the vendors had specifically agreed not to drop prices below $20, and you knew that they planned to do it everywhere they traveled on the East Coast, you could file a complaint against them. And on its face, that would be considered a per se violation of Section 1. What does that mean? You wouldn't have to come forward with the evidence of the rule of reason analysis test. They would have to try and prove that what they did was not unreasonable. Okay? Another example of where competitors engage in conduct that would automatically, if they did it, be considered a per se violation is if the vendors agree to divide the market. So let's take our 5 vendors who come to GEHO. If they decided, vendor 1 says, all right, at A&T, I'm going to get all of the business. You all are going to keep your shirts. You all are going to sell your shirts at $20, but at A&T, I'll sell mine for $15 so that I can gain the most sales. And then vendor 2, when we go to Central, you can sell your shirt at $15. The rest of us will sell ours at $20 so that we'll drive the sales to you. Then vendor 3, when we go to Howard, it'll be your turn to garner all the sales, so that they come up with an agreement where they manipulate it so to drive sales to each one of them in different locations. If you had evidence of that and you filed a complaint, on its face, that would be considered a violation of Section 1. Why? Because it would be a combination, contract, or conspiracy on the part of the 5 vendors to commit an unreasonable restraint of trade. They're also price fixing. Even though one is going lower than the others, they're still manipulating the market, right? They're not freely competing. And then the third element it would be affecting interstate trade because they're doing it at all these different locations across state lines. If you put that in your complaint as a plaintiff, you would not have to perform, you would not have to go through the rule of reason test that we just talked about. On its face, the court would say that is a Sherman Section 1 violation. Then it would be on the vendors to try and prove that it wasn't. The plaintiff wouldn't have to prove it. Alrighty? And then their last example is if you had a group boycott. So this is where two or more sellers, they refuse to deal with a particular person, refuse to sell to someone in order to eliminate competition or to prevent entry into the market. And that one's a little more unusual situation. There is a second section to the Sherman Antitrust Act. The first section refers to the conduct of competitors who act together via a combination, a contract, or a conspiracy. They work together to manipulate the market across interstate lines. Section 2 refers to individual sellers who by themselves are large enough to monopolize or manipulate the market. So any person who shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize any market and it affects interstate trade can also be punishable of up to $10 million if a corporation, $350,000 if you're an individual, and again, the possibility of going to federal prison. A Section 2 Sherman Act violation requires only two things. First, that the business or company at issue has market power and that they then use that market power to unfairly manipulate the market. So what does market power look like? Market power is defined as when a business has at least 70% of the market that it's operating within. At least 70%. So they don't have to be the largest, but they have to have the most, if you have 70% of the market, then clearly there's not a lot left for anyone else. But you have a significant share of the market such that you have the ability to really influence and control and manipulate potentially competitors. You can keep others out of the market because you are so large. But I want you to understand, it is not illegal to be the best in the business, to grow a business and have it be so successful that you are the top company, top provider, top seller in the market. That's what every business that opens wants to do. If you are an entrepreneur dreaming of, having a successful business, your goal is to start a business and become the best in whatever you're doing and dominate the market. That is not illegal. We're capitalists. That's not illegal. It's okay to be big and to be successful. What's illegal is if you're so large and then you become large and successful, and then you use that power to prevent others from competing with you on fair grounds. You somehow use your power to manipulate and shut out competitors. Example, there is a case of Microsoft, and you probably read about it. Microsoft had 90% of the market for operating systems. 90% of the market. So clearly they have monopoly power within their market. But that in and of itself is not illegal. But it was alleged that they used this power such that when they would sell their operating systems, they were insisting that purchasers install the browser that Microsoft was selling. They wanted purchasers to install Netscape in addition to the Microsoft Explorer browser. And so other companies found, who of course, companies that were creating other browsing systems, brought a federal action. Why? Because this is a violation of federal statute against Microsoft, claiming that they were violating Section 2 because they were using their market power, 90%, to create this unreasonable restraint on trade by insisting that everybody who purchased Microsoft use their browser. Because when they did that, what were they doing? They were pushing other potential competitors like Google out of the market. Because if 90% of the people who have systems are using Microsoft, and then Microsoft is insisting that if you buy our operating system, you got to use our browser, then that essentially erodes and takes away all of the market for independent browser providers. All right. So that is an example of how a company that was very successful, and it is very successful, Microsoft, it has 90% of the market, so it met our threshold of 70% or more, but then it used that power to try to force purchasers to purchase other products, which is also called tying, that Microsoft made. And by doing so, they were shutting out competitors. That's a Section 2 violation. If Microsoft has 90% of the market, and then they offer other services at, at prices, and then the purchasers can opt whether or not they want to use them, that's fine. But when they use their market power to force, manipulate, and drive out competitors, that's a Sherman 2 section violation. Another way that companies who have huge market power can manipulate the market is something called predatory pricing. This is a measure where the company that's got the market power, 70% or more of the share, temporarily drops their prices just low enough and just long enough to drive out competitors. Walmart has been accused of doing this all across the country. If you were to do a Google search and look for lawsuits against Walmart, particularly, as they move into new and locations that are remote in some, small areas where maybe Walmart is the first large retailer to come to an area, you will find many instances where the local, department store or the local Five and Dime or whatever they'd be called ended up bringing a lawsuit against Walmart saying when they were coming into the market, when they first relocated here, they dropped their prices unreasonably low just to drive us out of the market. And then once we closed, their prices went back up to the normal profit, garnering prices that you would expect to find for these products anywhere in the country. That can be hard to prove. And it's really difficult for the plaintiff who is saying they're the victim of it, because oftentimes the company gets, whoever the plaintiff is getting driven out of business before they can prove that this conduct is happening. And so then it's little consolation to them. But this has happened. And this is a very strategic yet illegal device that companies use. Now, what might Walmart say and retort? What might be their response to this? Couldn't they say, well, wait a minute, we're not engaging in predatory pricing. We enjoy economies of scale. We're large. We're huge. We buy in such massive volumes that we can legitimately offer our products at lower prices than a local business. And we can do that all over the country. And so we're not engaged in predatory pricing. We are passing along our savings due to our economies of scale to buyers. And that's what a free market does. Our customers, they benefit. That's why they shop with us, because we have lower prices. Get over it. We're successful. And that is often the retort that companies have when they are alleged of Section 2 violations. And Section 2 violations can be hard to establish because there is truth, and most of you are business students. You do get value by becoming large. That's the economy of scale. You're getting things cheaper, and if you're passing it along to customers, that's a great thing. So it is difficult. You would really have to have some evidence, if you're the plaintiff, that it was artificially low prices, and if you can also show that the pricing just dropped for a very short period of time, and for instance, if you could show that Walmarts in locations that were close by were not offering their prices, weren't offering the similar low prices, that could help. But again, this is a tough one because the plaintiff might actually be driven out of business before they could prove this. So what are the differences between a Section 1 and a Section 2 Sherman violation? Section 1 requires at least 2 or more people or businesses, because you've got to have at least 2 in order to contract, combine, or conspire together, right? So what we are making illegal is what's illegal here is the activity of getting together to manipulate prices. Section 2 only needs an individual person or individual business that has gained huge amounts. They have market power because they have at least 70% or more of the market. So they're large and successful, at least 70% of the market. And then they use that power to artificially manipulate the market in some way. Again, it is not illegal to be the best, to be successful. If you're Nike and everybody loves your sneakers, and because of it, you're huge in the market, that's not illegal. It's not until Nike starts somehow using that market power to make it more difficult for Adidas, Asics, Puma, any of their competitors to compete against them. If somehow they enter into contracts where other malls won't have stores that take those other competing brands, or if they enter into some sort of marketing relationship and it somehow shuts out all competition. It's only when you use your market power to depress competition that you have a Section 2 violation.